Welcome to the QAA Membership Podcast. My name is Kerr Castle and I'm a Quality Enhancement and Standards Specialist at QAA. In this episode, we talk about unpacking the hidden curriculum with Pam Birtill and Richard Harris from University of Leeds. Along with their colleague Madeline Pownell, Pam and Richard were first commissioned by QAA membership to produce the Student Guide to the Hidden Curriculum, a practical, student-facing resource explaining terminology that is a common feature of higher education across the sector. The Student Guide has been incredibly well received and we are very pleased to be able to share and discuss their latest resource, a guide for educators, designed to support staff to unpack the hidden curriculum in their local context. We start things off by discussing what the hidden curriculum is and why this matters, before turning our attention to the Student Guide to the Hidden Curriculum and reflecting on how this resource supports students. Pam and Richard then introduced the new Guide for Educators resource, explaining how staff can get started with unpacking the hidden curriculum in their subject area or across the wider institution, and how the guide interacts with the original student resource. We hope that you enjoy this podcast, and if you'd like to learn more about our work around supporting successful student transitions, visit qaa.ac.uk/membership. Well, let's get started then. So first up, I'd like to invite our guests to introduce themselves and tell us about their roles. Can I start with you, Richard?
Yes, I'm Richard Harris from the University of Leeds. I'm a lecturer in the School of Psychology and the Deputy Director of Student Education for Psychology.
Perfect, thanks, Rich. And Pam?
So I'm Pam Birtill. I'm Associate Professor of Psychology, again, at University of Leeds. I'm also Academic Lead for Leeds Expectations for Assessment and Feedback. So working kind of across the university on assessment-y things.
Brilliant, thank you. And would you like to tell us a little bit more about Madeline as well, the third member of the team?
Madeline Pownell is a recently appointed curriculum redefined lecturer in psychology. Curriculum redefined being a big program that's happening at Leeds at the moment to really refresh our curriculum. But she's also been working at Leeds for a number of years, completing her PhD and also teaching, and is a fabulous researcher and does lots and lots of stuff on open research and on pedagogy and all sorts of things.
Brilliant. Thank you both for joining me today. So let's start things off then with what seems like a basic question, but is actually a very big question. And that is, what is the hidden curriculum and why does it matter?
So hidden curriculum, it's kind of, the name's on the tin, isn't it? It's the stuff that's hidden. It's the stuff that isn't known about. It's the unknown unknowns. It's the things that students are expected to know and that we think that they know and that they don't. It's part of the mismatch between student expectations and staff expectations. So hidden curriculum can be things like how you do your referencing. So we say, oh, you must do your referencing in this way. And they go, but I don't know what that means. Or it can be things like what you're meant to do in a lecture. It's about the rules of the game, about the unspoken implicit assumptions. And it matters because students struggle often with knowing what the rules of the game are. If they don't know what it is that they're meant to do, and we're sometimes not very good at articulating what it is that they're meant to do, they can't do what they're meant to do, and then they struggle and they don't succeed. And we find that there are differences in terms of students and their ability to access that hidden curriculum. So there's a certain amount where students who are maybe confident, who have got cultural capital, can ask questions. They feel confident to approach members of staff and try and discover what the rules of the game are. And not all students have that. And so it can exacerbate inequalities.
Although sort of hidden curriculum does what it says on the tin, it does mean different things to different people in different contexts as well. So sometimes what we identify as being hidden curriculum might not necessarily translate into other contexts, but there tends to be lots of overlap in what we consider to be hidden curriculum.
I think it's possibly worth adding in that it is important to get the student voice when trying to discover what the hidden curriculum is, because by its very nature, it's hard for us to know what it is that the students don't know. So, while we might bring years of experience as personal tutors and as teachers to kind of going, well, these are the things that students often ask us about, there's still things that we don't necessarily know that they don't know. And so that student voice is really important.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I guess they don't know. Again, it's slightly tricky, isn't it, in terms of the timeline, but they don't know the consequence of the things that they don't know at that point either. So I guess you're sort of relying on those who are further down the line, and you've got a better sense of the sort of impact there.
I think it can also be the case that in the first year, there is so much that's unknown, it's quite overwhelming. And so actually it's kind of, what's the low-hanging fruit? What are the things that you can help them to know sooner, so that then they can actually be better at finding out the other things that they don't know?
That's great, Pam. Thank you. So building on what we've discussed so far then, what is the student guide to the hidden curriculum?
Yeah, so our student guide to the hidden curriculum serves the purpose of basically giving students access to the language that they're going to hear whilst they're studying their degree. So, for example, it explains different terms that students are going to hear. So what's a tutorial? What's a lecture? What does this person do within the university? And hopefully by understanding these terms and knowing these terms, it makes it easier for students to kind of engage during their time at university and know the sorts of things that they're going to hear and experience whilst they're studying for their degree. It also does some broader stuff as well. So it kind of explains to students some information around kind of study behavior and what might be expected of them. So not just necessarily a glossary of terms, but also starting to unpick some of those unwritten rules of academia that would be useful for students to be aware of when they're studying for their degree.
So we also try and address some of the kind of jargon that's used. So things like credits, students often, even before they arrive at university, have to make choices about optional modules. And there's language in there about things like credits. And they go, what's a credit? So try and explain some of that as well. We try and explain things like the classification system. So, the British classification system of first class, 2-1, 2-2, and so forth is actually quite unusual. It's not something that's shared internationally. And so we try and explain that to students as well, and try and begin to address some of the things to do with assessment where students don't necessarily understand that how we mark is in a holistic way, and that actually if you get a 68, it's not that you've done 3 things better than if you get a 65. So trying to really address some of those things that students come in with kind of preconceptions about, and going, actually in university it might not be quite like you think it is something a little bit different.
Can you maybe tell me a little bit more about how you approached the development of the guide? And I know it was obviously evaluated further down the line as well. So can you maybe talk a little bit about that? So
we took an approach where we started off by just literally listing terms that students ask us about. And to be completely honest, I sat around my dining table with my kids who are about to go to university and said, do you know what this is? Do you know what that is? Have you heard of this term? And kind of went through and began to create a set of language words that weren't well understood by them, and things that I'm always having to kind of explain to students. We then also created a Padlet page, which we shared on Twitter, and said to people, what do you think students need to know about when they're coming to university? So we used that to help add to the terms we were explaining as well. So from that, we created a whole set of definitions and of kind of explanations. And then we went through and kind of grouped them together. It's like, actually, these things are all about kind of assessment. These things are all about who the people are. We sent it off to QAA and they made it look beautiful. It looks so pretty. They really managed to make it look really approachable, and not just like a dry Word document. So I think that's really helpful. And then we went through an evaluation process where we identified things that we hadn't explained that students really wanted to know about, and where actually we kind of had over-explained and it was really a bit obvious and we didn't really need to explain that.
The evaluation was actually very useful to get more student voice into the guide and I think it identified some things that, as Pam suggested, were maybe just over-explained and a little bit too basic and unnecessary that could come out. And then allowed us to have more space to add in some terms that we hadn't thought about, and the academic community that we asked also hadn't thought about. I think what was clear from the evaluation is that actually there's definitely a need for this resource. And some of the final year students that completed the evaluation for us mentioned that they wish they kind of knew these terms much earlier on. Some of them still didn't quite know the definition of some of these terms, even though they were in their final year of their degree as well. So it's obviously something that it is something that is really valuable to students, even at different points throughout their degree, not just those first year students that haven't encountered those terms at all. Even students that hear them quite regularly don't necessarily know what they mean and are just sort of surviving through their degree.
Yeah, because that's what I was going to say. I suppose initially the guide was developed or the focus was slightly more on those transitions into higher education and the sort of support that incoming students might need. But it definitely seems to be a resource that they can revisit and that has that value over time. Like you're saying, that's important to kind of emphasize that here. I think that it's not a once and done and it's part of your induction or that kind of first semester, but actually it's something that's really valuable throughout the whole learner journey.
Something that our students often say to us is that they don't like to ask questions. They don't like asking stupid questions. They don't want to feel stupid because they should know this stuff. So this at least is one way that they can kind of access this knowledge if they don't feel confident enough to ask about, what does this term actually mean? Because everyone else around me seems to know what this term means. So who can I ask? Well, this is what the function of the guide, I guess, is allowing students to access some of that information without having to necessarily ask the stupid question in their eyes. Obviously, we're more than happy for them to ask us, but at least it allows them access to that knowledge without having to feel confident to ask their questions.
I think there's also something quite powerful in saying to students, there is this hidden curriculum. There is stuff that you don't know, that we don't know, that you don't know. And that in itself gives them permission to ask questions. But I think the other thing that's quite interesting is the way that we approached the evaluation. So rather than just, give it out to our students and their friends or our friends and their students, we used Prolific Academic, which is a tool for recruiting participants, which meant we actually got a really wide cross-section of students completing the evaluation. We had a huge percentage of mature students who are completing it, students who were, first in family. So we often, particularly at University of Leeds, might struggle to get a diverse student voice present in some of the work that we do, but we really felt that was a diverse voice that we were getting. But it did highlight as well in the evaluation that there are very big differences across universities and that some of the terms that we explain don't transfer so well into other contexts. And that's something that it makes it it's difficult to produce a generic guide. But that's something we just have to acknowledge, that it's not the same everywhere. There are differences between universities.
And we make that point in the guide as well. So sometimes when we've defined terms, we say, it might be this term, it might be this alternative term or something that we haven't even considered yet, but it kind of looks like this. And it might be, there might be a different term that's used, but it's sort of this thing to try and get over some of that issues around sort of local context.
And even within a university, across different programs, you can get different uses of language and different uses of terms. And that can actually be really challenging for students who might be doing elective modules in a number of different schools. They might be a joint honours student. And I think that makes it really important for us as academics to begin to reflect on the language that we use and whether we actually explain the terminology and the specific meaning of words within our own contexts and disciplines.
And what, in your opinion, then, is the consequence of students not knowing these sorts of things or asking these questions? Do you see that impact in any specific way, or is it something that's less tangible or quantifiable?
I can think of where I have seen the impact. So, for example, I might have a tutee who, when I'm giving them some feedback on a piece of work, they'll say, oh, well, I didn't understand that was what I was meant to be doing. And I'll say, oh, you could have come and asked. Oh, I didn't know I was allowed to ask. So that's the way that you can see some impact. It's about those behaviours. Whereas some students will ask and they'll be happy for you to say, sorry, I can't answer that. That's too specific a question. Others just won't even come and try and ask. Similarly, some students won't necessarily understand things like how they can access journal articles. And so we've actually discovered some students might have paid £35 to be able to access a journal article. It's like, you don't need to do that. You can get it through the library. So there are things to do with that as well. And then a lot of things to do with things like reading lists. So as academics, we might give a reading list that's maybe 30 journal articles with the expectation that students will understand. They just pick out 2 or 3 that they're really interested in. But some students are utterly stressed that they've not read every single article. So those are the sorts of behaviours and the impacts that it has on the students. It's often about increasing their stress or about not allowing them to perform to their best ability.
And more broadly as well, I think it can impact on students' sense of belonging, right? So if they're already struggling to feel like they belong at the university, maybe for whatever reason, maybe because of their background or culture or upbringing or whatever it is, and they don't feel necessarily that they belong here, they feel different from others, then having all of these extra words that they don't know only increases that kind of lack of belonging to the university.
It's kind of like alienation, isn't it? It's like, yeah, it's interesting. And I think, talking about the students that might not feel they belong, there is an impact of COVID in terms of students who may not feel that they've earned their place because they've not had the traditional A-level exams to access higher education. And there's also been a lack of cultural transmission because, first year students would come in, they would normally be able to talk to second year students. The second year students haven't had the same experiences because everything was in lockdown. So you've got this kind of gap as well at the moment where normally students might be able to ask each other, they might be able to network with more experienced students, but even more experienced students have actually got this thing of like, this is my first lecture, I still don't know how to behave in this context. And so I think that makes it particularly important at the moment as this point of inflection where we may be going back to more in person, where we might be going and learning the lessons of COVID and doing more things online because actually that suits the pedagogy. But as we've got this process of transition and change, the hidden curriculum becomes even more important and impactful.
Yeah, and I think that leads us back nicely to a previous point about unpacking the hidden curriculum within your own local context and like we're saying about terminology being different. I'm kind of keen for us to think then about staff and how they can make use of the new Unpacking Your Hidden Curriculum, a guide for educators that you've developed as well. So can you tell us a little bit more about the new guide for staff?
So, following on from our evaluation where it became really clear that there are these local differences, what we wanted to do was to give people the space and possibly a structure to begin to think about what their expectations for students are and how they can help make these things more accessible for students. So it's a really short guide. It's like 2 pages with a template, 3 pages, I think, where we kind of explain the idea of hidden curriculum and its importance for other educators, because it's not something you necessarily think about. It's not necessarily something that's at the forefront of your mind. It's hidden. That's kind of the nature of it, isn't it? So we kind of wanted to, first of all, make it a bit more of a salient thing to think about for staff, and then to kind of give them a guideline about how they might think about what that is within their own context. So it's really simple. It's just a set of reflective questions, really, and then like a template. So it's reflective questions like, thinking back over your personal tutoring sessions, what the students keep asking you. Because actually, if you stop and think, you kind of know the things that some students tend to struggle with. And then in the template, it's kind of like, what is this term? Where do you try and explain this to students, and how can you make this clearer to students? So it's just kind of like a reflection about where you currently are and how you might move forward to make some improvement. It's fairly common sense, but I think it's about providing that space and that structure, because that makes it easier. And we're all very busy. So anything that makes it easier to kind of think about these things in a structured way seems like it's going to be useful. We had incredibly warm response to our student guide to the hidden curriculum. And I'm really looking forward to seeing kind of how the staff guide goes down and kind of how people respond to it.
Yeah, I think just to pick up on your point as well, Pam, as you were speaking, I was saying, actually, it hasn't been hard for us to sort of reflect on our teaching and the way that we talk to students and think about the sorts of things that are kind of meaningless to them unless you explain them. And it's not even necessarily explain them. Just can you use a simpler set of words that are more meaningful? And just like on Monday, you and I were having a chat about formative and summative assessments. And I used formative, I think, when I meant summative. And it's like, well, if we are making mistakes because these terms are sort of detached from meaning, then why bother using the words formative and summative? Students are much more familiar with mocks, for example, rather than formative. So we could, even rather than just necessarily explaining the more abstract terms, we can just use much more straightforward language that just gives students immediate access to what we mean.
Yeah, because I suppose as well, it feeds into that broader learner community piece, doesn't it? In that, like you're saying there, Rich, I get a sense that, that is a dialogue in a sense with students, not that you're going to radically change your terminology to accommodate a particular cohort, but actually you do need to tap into the language that they understand, and if there are gaps, kind of reinforce and support them, so that they then understand what they don't know. So it feels like that's quite an active thing in a sense. But as you've said as well, Pam, as much as the new guide is shorter, I think in a sense that's actually what's appealing about it, in that it is, for want of a better term, a quick win. It's very accessible, it's easy to pick up and make sense of, and actually you could begin to work with it right away and already make improvements to what you're delivering.
Yeah, I think that what we wanted to do is produce something that was really practical, and is just, like you say, it's not that this is a difficult thing to do. It's just about being a little bit more transparent. And like Rich was saying, the way that language is used is really important. And, this is important for students in terms of them being able to articulate the skills that they're developing as well. There's no point in them saying, I was able to do a critical evaluation of a piece of research, because an employer's not going to understand that. To be able to say, I was able to look at some evidence and understand its importance and its impact, that is something that everybody can understand. So I think it's a thing about moving away from using quite archaic, often academic terminology, and beginning to bring it into the kind of authentic real world language.
And it's not a task that has to be time consuming or done on a particular point in time. It's just something that you can just sort of bear in mind and reflect on your practice. And if you are delivering a type of course and you get lots of questions on this one particular thing, what did you mean when you said X? Or are you getting questions from students about what does this term mean? Then, just reflect on that and think, is there a more appropriate term that I can use? Is there a better way of defining this and explaining it to students? But ultimately it becomes time saving. If you have fewer questions that you need to answer because students have understood the first time round what you mean by this, then that saves you time in the future. So I think the guide is just there to act as a bit of a prompt to encourage staff to sort of reflect on the language that they're using, and the terms that they're using, and how they might be able to unpack this for students in a kind of more accessible way.
I think it's also helpful for staff in terms of how we work together, because actually, if I say I'm designing a module and I'm going to have a seminar, that has no meaning. What is a seminar? For some people, a seminar is where students will sit together in small groups and discuss. For others, it might be where students will do a presentation. For others, it might be where they're working through a problem sheet. And it's like, actually, why use that really, really ambiguous term? Use a term or use a description, which is much more transparent. And one of the things, we've got staff coming into the university, international staff who are coming through straight from PhD. Part of making part of helping students to have an equitable and consistent experience is making sure that as staff, we've got a shared understanding of these terms. And so this ambiguity around language really doesn't help anybody. And the more transparent and clear that we can be, that's just better for students and for staff.
How does the new guide then interact with the student version?
So I think the new guide is for staff in institutions to be able to think about their own practice. How it interacts with the student version is, I think that the student version, the way that we've written it is in very clear, transparent, simple language. And I think that can be a model for people in terms of how they might produce their own version. I think the student version helps to open the conversation. And I think it would be quite reasonable for staff to take, the student version and share that with students and then say, so tell us about the things that aren't here. What are the other things? What questions have you still got? And I think, like I said earlier, it helps us to open up the fact of the hidden curriculum. It makes the fact that there is this thing less of a taboo. I think it makes it okay for us to say, yeah, we do use all this language and it's really not helpful, is it? So, and to work then with students to improve all of that all the way through.
So the staff guide is there just to act as a prompt for staff to be like, yeah, what are the terms? But if you can work with students and, get a student voice from your local context to be like, well, actually, these are the things in this degree, in this institution that we are struggling with, that's doing a lot of the work that the staff guide is trying to achieve, which is, reflect. And one way of doing that, well, talk to your students, find out the things that they struggle with. And once you identify that in your local context, the guide, the student guide could be updated for your local context. You could just find different avenues in which you can explain some of this language and expectations of kind of your degree program to your students. So they kind of work, I guess, in tandem in that sense.
I think that's really helpful. And I think it leads us nicely then to just my final question, which is really what comes next, what are the next steps from your perspective, and what would you like to see happen with the guide and this hidden curriculum work going forward? So
we're going to be talking about the staff guide at a number of events and conferences. We're happy to come and talk to people about how you might go through this process. We are going to be publishing, hopefully, we've currently submitted a kind of reflective commentary and the evaluation of the process of writing this guide, of the student guide. And then next, I think, is beginning to think about moving on our understanding of hidden curriculum from just unpacking the terminology to beginning to think about how can we really make the rules of the game a bit more transparent? How does this impact different groups of students? How does it interact with things like imposter phenomenon? And how to, increase sense of belonging for students? How to remove the jargon? How to make it, to some extent, you shouldn't need to provide a dictionary to decode how we speak. We need to make it more transparent and move towards that everyday language a bit more.
People are using the staff guide. I think it'd be really interesting for us to know whether people are using it, but also the sorts of things that they've identified that were sort of the hidden curriculum in their context. I think that'd be really interesting for us to learn about. It could lead to future iterations of the student guide, for example, if there's lots of consistencies across different contexts to the sorts of terms that students get confused, but they're not in the student guide. That would be really helpful to know. But I think it'd just be useful for Pam, Maddie and myself to know the way in which this guide is being used amongst staff in particular. Particularly as we think about some of the workshops that we've got coming up and how people are using it. I think that would be really informative and interesting to know about.
Thank you so much to Pam and Richard for joining us today. As mentioned at the top of the podcast, if you'd like to find out more about QAA's work around supporting successful student transitions, including work around the hidden curriculum, visit qaa.ac.uk/membership. Thanks again for listening. We really hope you enjoyed the conversation and look forward to sharing more content like this with you soon.